Hello and welcome to the DMPL Podcast. I'm Aaron Gurnis, your host, and today on the podcast we have our final author in our 2024 Fall Author Series, Daniel Kraus. Daniel is a writer of several books. Probably, I think we talked before the podcast about 26 he thinks he's written now, but his most recent, Pay the Piper, came out in September. It's a finished novel from horror legend George Romero's notes in his we'll talk about it. I can't remember his archive at the University of Pittsburgh. Daniel found these. So Daniel, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good, good. A little under the weather today, but I'm gonna push through it.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming on, even though you're under the weather. I gotta say you look good. You sound good, so we're happy to have you here. First of all, yeah, let's talk about Pay the Piper. This is the reason that you're going to be out on tour, and this is a great, great book. You found it in the notes, I believe you said in the back of it, of George Romero, who of course horror director, legend. He's written Mini, the living, or what? Why the film series is dropping out of my head right now. It's Night of the Living Dead, that trilogy. Actually, you have already we'll talk about it. You worked on a previous unfinished novel of his, but talk a little bit about Pay the Piper and how it came together, because you say in it it's a book that George wanted to write, but maybe not the one that he'd been like. It's not quite zombie-ish, so it's not the book that he's been writing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was known as a filmmaker, so he had written.
Yeah, first of all, yes, that.
He had written hundreds of scripts, and twice he tried a novel. And the first one was called The Living Dead, and that one was a public thing. Like, people knew he was working on it. He talked about it in interviews. And then about a month after he died in 2017, I was contacted by his wife and manager to see if I might be interested in finishing the book, because he had worked on it for many years and just couldn't really crack it or stay with it all the way. And I was Romero's biggest fan. I've been watching Night of the Living Dead since I was a 5-year-old kid in Fairfield, Iowa, where I grew up. So I'd been following Romero my entire life, studying his works. I wouldn't be writing at all if it weren't for Romero. So yes, I said yes to that. I got involved with it. The book came out. It's called The Living Dead. And then right around the time I was finishing up that book, I was in his archives, which were a new presence at the University of Pittsburgh. And I came across a second unfinished novel. It was called Pay the Piper, and it was in this, just sort of randomly in this box in two manila envelopes. And part of me was super excited because no one knew about this project. It was an entirely secret project, basically, and a little daunted too, because I just finished Living Dead, which is it's a giant tome. So I was like, oh, I'm ready to do this again. But it seemed like a smaller book at least. So I thought, well, maybe we should get the band back together one more time and do Pay the Piper. So it was a different process. He didn't leave any notes for the Pay the Piper. There was actually more written of Pay the Piper than there was The Living Dead, but there were no notes this time. So the process was a little different.
What's it like? I mean, I guess you have two different processes that you've already worked on, but I mean, finishing someone's work or trying to piece together their thought process on these things rather than something that's whole cloth from your own mind. It's a different process, and I'm sure there's a lot of pieces you got to patch together and things that you got to kind of create out of your own element as well.
Yeah, it's really hard. I've done other collaborations with living people, and it's every collaboration has its own challenges, and that's part of the reason why you do it. The reason why I do it anyway is to push myself in new directions. But the two Romero books were easily the most difficult projects I've done, just because you don't have that other person to bounce ideas off of. You have to sort of stand in for them, or I have to stand in for Romero to sort of stand up for his thoughts. So I might have an idea, but then I have to kind of turn around and think, well, would he agree with this? Would he be okay with me going this direction? So I have to kind of wrestle with myself a little bit. So that's very difficult, I found. And I mean, I hold Romero in such high regard that I was always very, very careful about cutting anything.
Hmm.
You have to in a book. You inevitably you're going to cut things. Uh, but I knew his pages were finite. I couldn't go back to him and say, you know, can you write me another 10 pages here or there? Uh, so I would often do in both books was find another way to use things that didn't work. Like I would take action that didn't make any sense where it was, but move it a couple hundred pages and or combine two characters or give action A to character B. I would try to find ways to keep his prose present in the book as much as possible, but it was really challenging. Yeah.
How do you write prose for someone that hasn't written a novel before, has a bunch of screenplays out there? Do you study his scripts? Do you see how he writes action within the scripts, or did like how do you get that prose then and try to find his voice within that?
Well, I mean, it's true he was mostly a screenwriter, but it weren't, these two books aren't based on notes. They're based on partial manuscripts.
Sure. Okay.
So he had written hundreds of pages.
Yeah.
So I could get a really good sense of what his prose style was. Now, my job wasn't to copy his style. My job was to, in the editing of his work, sort of establish a third style. That was what he and I sound like when we're together.
Hmm.
And so once I'd sort of processed and edited his pages, suddenly I knew what we sounded like together, and I could continue that voice through the rest of the book.
Did you have a relationship with Romero before the estate contacted you?
That's a great question. Not really. I had met him before, but just sort of socially. We hadn't, we hadn't talked about collaborating or anything, and that was about 10 years before he died. Um, and I hadn't spoken to him in a decade,
Yeah.
in that decade before he died. Um, but you know, his manager remembered how devoted I was to his work, and not just his zombie films, but of all of his films,
Hmm.
which I sort of understood and appreciated. Um, the sort of entirety of his career, which is something that I think was important to the Romero estate, is that people generally, a lot of people tend to just kind of focus in on Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and that they kind of stop. But Romero made a ton of other movies, and his interest was, although he was appreciative of the success the zombie movies had given him, you know, his biggest regret in his career was that he wasn't allowed to make other kinds of movies and write other kinds of stories. So coming at it from that point of view, where I saw him as a whole artist rather than just the zombie guy, was important. And I think that's why Pay the Piper was
Yeah.
such an important book to him. Like I could feel his excitement coming off those pages because it had
Yeah.
nothing to do
Describe so Pay the Piper, not a zombie story. It's set in the deep Louisiana bayou. It's based kind of off of a Pied Piper story, but there's more to it mythologically and stuff like that. But describe just discovering these pages and realizing that, like as someone that's a huge fan of his entire career, his entire catalog, seeing that this is a story. I think you said in the back of your author's note, like this is a story that he wanted to write, not necessarily one that he had been allowed to write, if that makes sense, or something like that.
Yeah, I think for The Living Dead, it was the book that he was kind of expected to write, like, and wanted to write in a way. Like he never got the budget he wanted for his zombie movie. So
Hmm.
The Living Dead allowed him a kind of an endless budget to write whatever he wanted and not have to worry about actually filming it. But Pay the Piper though was filled with the stuff that, having studied Romero in his life, um, that I knew he was just really excited about, like his own personal enthusiasms. There's elements of like jungle adventures and westerns, um, just all these sort of enthusiasms of his that are fairly esoteric and don't fit into the normal box of the horror genre. And he came up with a story that allowed him to weave in all of his favorite things, which was great for him and great for readers. Hard for me because he didn't leave any notes. He just seemed to stop one day almost in the middle of a paragraph. We'll never know why. And I was left to study what he had left, to find clues about to where he was still going.
That's curious. Yeah, it's such a fascinating tidbit. So it's set in the bayou, and I think one of the most distinctive things about this book is just the setting. It feels, you can feel the humidity coming off the page. How much, I guess, like, how much did you know about the deep south? Like, it's south of New Orleans there by the Gulf. How much did you know about how it actually felt there? How much of that was in George's prose? I'm sure a lot of it, but like, what else did you have to do to kind of really make sure that setting felt true to life too? Because it does feel true to life. It's set in the late 90s. It feels like it's right with, I mean, I haven't been there, but it feels like I could be there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I didn't know much about the Bayou, but that didn't scare me.
Yeah.
I like, I like, my last book was about a scuba diver who gets trapped inside of a
Yeah.
whale.
Yep.
I don't know
Whale
anything about
fall.
scuba diving.
If you haven't heard of whale fall.
I don't know anything about scuba diving or whales either, but I learned.
Yeah.
And so the same situation here is I was really just excited because the setting was so unique and so sensory and visceral. I had spent some time in New Orleans, but not really much of the Bayou. So I did go down there, and I traipsed around in about as far as you can go into the Bayou until you run out of road, basically.
Yeah.
And after that, you probably need a guide with a boat, which I did not have. But so I visited there. I did a lot of research on the Bayou and sort of the ecological issues down there, and I studied Cajun culture and Cajun French and all these kind of things that I would need to know to finish the book. It seemed clear to me that Romero had done a lot of research. There's a there's a whole sort of scaffolding of the book that has to do with the pirates Lafitte, who are these real life pirates who operated down there. Uh, he had done his homework there. I did my homework too. I read a bunch of books about them. Um, so yeah, it was a lot of research, but I'm used to research. I really like research. So it wasn't troublesome to me at all.
It's a wonderful book. If you haven't picked it up yet, you can pick it up at the library. We'll be talking a lot about that, I'm sure, and your process there as well on the 23rd when you come to the Central Library here. I'm going to transition to a few other things because you did talk about how you've done partnerships with living people, including one pretty prominent person, I'd say, Mr. Guillermo del Toro, and you did the novelization for his Academy Award-winning movie, The Shape of Water, which I believe actually became a best-selling novelization itself, if I remember right.
Yes.
That's such another very interesting process, I think. Here you have the full screenplay, the full vision in front of you, but you're still trying to translate these very vivid pictures into words. And you're working with someone, someone who has a very distinctive vision himself as well, I imagine. What was it like working with Guillermo on that process?
Well, it's not exactly a novelization. I mean, it's the Shape of Water began with an idea I had when I was a kid in Iowa. So that's where the book and the movie began. Is I had this idea for I was probably in fifth or sixth grade or something. And then when I was working with Guillermo on another project called Troll Hunters,
No, fun by the way.
I told him about my idea, and it became Shape of Water, the movie and the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. Unique process for sure. My memory of it is mostly one of panic because I just remember for various reasons I didn't have a lot of time. Like everything was happening very quickly. He was making the movie. We had to finish the book. I just remember a lot of just working really hard and really fast. But I always had a good time with Guillermo. Always had fun with him. I was able to go to the Venice Film Festival premiere of it and a couple other film festivals, and I was actually at the Oscars too. So it was always fun to see the gang and to see Guillermo, It definitely was a trip. The whole process. It's not every day that some idea you have as a little kid wins Best Picture.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a bizarre. Yeah, I have to kind of stop and think about it. It was a pretty bizarre set of events that happened there, but definitely something that I uh, treasure in a way. I should take some time and appreciate it more often.
I'm surprised, yeah, I see you have the picture of your novel in the back behind you there. I'm surprised, it's not The Shape of Water or maybe something something to that regard, a little bit of a shrine in the apartment there, because I probably would be doing that myself if I were you.
Well, I have one of the original sketches
That's cool.
that became the poster for Shape of
Probably
Water.
in your office somewhere.
Yeah, it's right through that door over there.
Nice.
So I've got something.
Good reminder that you're doing some cool stuff already out there when you're working on stuff, I imagine. You also, I've watched a little bit of Troll Hunters in my time. I haven't finished the trilogy, but that's also a fun little thing, and it kind of is a little outside the box for what you've. I don't know if outside the box is right, but the right term. But like, talk about working on that kind of like kids animated series,
Well,
going through and working with Netflix and Guillermo on that. Because if you haven't seen Troll Hunters, it's probably meant for what ages 8 to 15, something like that, 8 to 14.
yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say about the show because I was very much not involved in it.
Okay,
Essentially, Guillermo and I wrote a novel called Troll Hunters, and it was adapted into the Netflix show. So I wasn't really involved with the show. I just co-wrote the source material.
nice.
So yeah, I mean, I can tell you about the book, but it is fun. And you're right, it is sort of outside of what I normally do. I just don't normally write. I don't write a ton of books for kids at that age. I
Yeah.
have written some, but not a ton, and certainly not stuff with that kind of fun attitude. My stuff tends to be a little darker. And
Hmm.
the Trawler's book is a fair bit darker than the TV show. Like it is, it's darker. The characters are a little older, um, so things were lightened up quite a bit for the TV show. I can tell you that much.
Okay. Nice. Um, you talked about Shape of Water coming from an idea you had when you were in fifth grade, sixth grade, and you actually mentioned earlier you grew up in Fairfield, Iowa. So talk a little bit about, that Iowa experience, because obviously it's something in you growing up in Iowa, brought these ideas to the forefront of your mind, led to this creativity that you have today, and you've set some books in Iowa. So what was it like growing up in Iowa, and how do you think that's kind of spurned some creativity for you over the years?
Yeah, yeah. I grew up in Iowa from. I was in Iowa from ages 4 to through college, so whatever that is, point two or something like that. Um, and yeah, I feel like in a way, growing up in a rural area was really good for my writing, um, and maybe growing up in the time period that I did. So I think I graduated high school in 1993, so that sort of establishes the time period.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think what it did for me was I learned to work in isolation, kind of, which was, which is what a writer pretty much does. Mostly I'm just writing here at my desk alone every day. I learned to really enjoy that, and because there was nothing set up in sort of the ecosystem where I would a way for me to share any of my writing as a kid, and I was writing novella length stuff by middle school, and I was writing novels in high school, but I wasn't sharing it with anyone because there was no like architecture in place where I would share things, and so it never really even occurred to me. I would just write these books and enjoy them, and then put them in a drawer. And I think that has been really good for um, my work ethic, in that I really learned to love the process without any expectation of uh, some sort of plaudits or some sort of um, praise coming at the other end of it. To this day, it's like the release of a book is not super exciting for me. It's really the writing.
Yeah.
Uh, it's so I'm still writing like I did as a kid, um, I think it's very healthy. My emotions are not tied to how people react to it, reviews, none of those things. I don't really interact with them much.
I mean, if you've been writing that long and you had so long without, you said no interaction about your writing, you're just writing and writing and putting things in a drawer. Did that make it difficult the first time you were sat down and like were getting an editing process going or like got critiques or was it because you were so confident in your writing at that point when you were starting to become a published writer? Do you think that it was easier for you because you knew you had you had good stuff in there and you saw yourself develop and grow?
No, because it wasn't just so that direct from A to B. In my 20s, I mostly made a living as a freelance writer for magazines.
Sure.
So I became very well versed in the editorial process. That wasn't something.
Sure.
Maybe it was a little new to me, but also, you get used to that stuff just in school.
Mm-hmm.
And in assignments, and you get marks taken off for this and that. So I don't think I had any more difficulty with the editorial process than anyone else, really.
Gotcha. Growing up in rural Iowa, too, we chatted a little bit before we started the podcast here about that and how, as a horror writer, a writer of dread, there are certain settings in Iowa that, in rural Iowa and rural parts of the Midwest, really, that can inspire, just like the Deep Bayou inspired Pay the Piper. There are certain settings across this state, across this part of the country, that can inspire horror settings and dread. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that some of those locales might have played a part in your writing as well?
Yeah, I definitely, in retrospect, in hindsight, see a lot of creepiness in Iowa that I don't think I fully internalized when I was living there, just because you're so used to your environments. Um, but yeah, like the rural Midwest is filled with creepy, lonely farmhouses. Anything inside which anything could be happening. That's what's so scary about them. It's like the alien catchphrase: "In space, no one can hear you scream." Well, in the middle, the rural Midwest, nobody hear you scream. Like the houses are so spread out. So there's I think, an intrinsic, I don't know, danger, mystery to places like that. And then there's the all the dirt roads that look the same and all the cornfields that look the same. There's a very strong sense that there's something maze-like about the rural countryside where you can get lost real easy. I think particularly for people who aren't from Iowa, that's immediately sort of panic inducing. Just
Yeah.
the sameness of the acre after acre of land it's unsettling, I think, for a lot of people.
I came back from a party, a friend's party one time in Madison. We're driving back on a Sunday afternoon, and we're driving, I think, between Waterloo and I-80 there, and it had snowed. And I think, what you're talking about there, if you just looked off to your left and you looked off to your right, and all you see is white to the horizon, including the sky itself. And to me, it felt like for a second there, we were in a time vortex. Like it just was like, this road is not going to end. We're never going to get to this exit. Am I stuck here forever? And I think that's kind of like that kind of paralyzing. It's not claustrophobia. It's whatever the opposite of claustrophobia is, but that paralyzing fear of the ever expanding foreverness. And there's no end to what we see.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I a lot of my books are set in Iowa because it's so palpable to me, all those feelings of endlessness, but also almost paradoxically, it's endless, but it's also all that space might as well be a moat. Like you're also, back then anyway, pre-internet, you're also sort of trapped. There's not you can't get out to other people in a way that you could in a city high-rise where you could just go up a flight of stairs and talk to 30 new people.
All right, we're going to be wrapping up here, but I do want to talk about the horror genre in general before we wrap up. feels like it's having a little bit of a moment here. Do you sense that? Do you sense that there's there seems to be more interest, maybe a more mainstream interest, I should say. There's always been a huge following of horror literature, but it feels like to me there's kind of maybe some more interest in horror movies as well, but there's more interest just from the mainstream about what kind of creative ideas horror writers and writers of dread have these days.
Yeah, I think that's right. I feel like about 6 or 7 years ago, there started to be um, a peak of interest in horror, and these things they come and go. The '80s, of course, were a huge boom time for horror. I think a lot of that was based on the advent of VHS and VHS stores and Stephen King paperbacks and all that stuff. Less so in the '90s and the O's. Um, but yeah, maybe like 20, I feel like 2017, somewhere in there, things started to shift a little bit. And now I think it's much more common to see horror writers it, invited into the same kind of spaces that um, kind of quote unquote normal writers would be in. And I'm not strictly a horror writer. I've written all sorts
Yeah,
of
yeah.
genres, but a lot of my books do at least either are horror or horror adjacent.
Yeah, that's what I
Um,
meant by kind of like writers of dread. There's like
yeah,
sometimes, yeah, like dread isn't necessarily like dread is part of horror, but there can be dread without dread intention in that same vein without being strictly horror,
yeah.
strictly
I,
monster.
I actually wonder if horror as a genre would have been better served if the genre was called dread and not horror.
Yeah.
Because horror is such a strong emotion that a lot of books that are labeled as horror aren't going to have you like screaming. They're just going to be unsettling. So I think dread is almost a better word.
Um, do you think horror, my last question for you, do you think horror, dread, how do you think it responds to what is going on in the world around it? It feels like a genre that really does kind of like play off of the actual real life events of the world, I guess, and do you think that's true?
I don't know. It's certainly something that is said a lot, and people will talk about George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, kind of coming out of the Vietnam era. Like it makes a lot of sense when you use specific examples, or how you know post 9/11 or Abu Ghraib, there was like the advent of the torture movies like Saw and all that stuff. Like I feel like if you pick out the right examples, that it always seems to track when you say this. But I'm always a little bit hesitant to sign off on this idea. Like there's just so many other pieces of art out there.
Yeah.
It's maybe what rises to the top. Maybe there's got to be something to it. I mean, we don't
Kind of
live
like
in
a correlation causation type thing.
yeah, I don't really know, but there's got to be something to it. We don't write in vacuums.
Yeah.
There's, and and there's got to be something to it because it's happened so often that you'll have, two or three books or two or three movies all come out once that have the same basic idea. Like that, things happen in clumps. So there's something in the ether that does direct people to have certain types of ideas at certain times.
All right. Well, we're going to be wrapping up here again. Daniel will be here Wednesday, October 23rd at 7 p.m. at the Central Library in downtown Des Moines. Daniel, what are you going to be talking about when you come here?
Well, first of all, I'm going to be much healthier. So I'm going to be higher energy. I don't know. I usually go into these things knowing as little as possible. I think that
That's
creates
awesome.
better conversations. Certainly, we'll be talking about Pay the Piper. Probably talking about Whale Fall, but I'm open to talking about anything.
Yeah, yeah, we haven't even touched on whale fall here, but I feel like that's a lot of people will be coming there too to ask questions about that. And I know our our your moderator, Rebecca. If you know the Southside Library, you might know Rebecca. Rebecca is a fan of Daniel's and has read a lot of your work, so she'll be pretty ready to go as well. So, well, Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us today. We look forward to having you here on the 23rd, and can't wait to have you back in your home state here in Iowa.
Yeah, can't wait. You'll be surprised how infrequently I get asked to come back to Iowa. So it is really fun.
Well, good. Well, we're glad to make that happen for you.